I'm going to do a very condensed version of the life of Martin Luther. Here's my wonderful bobblehead. So I want to give you some resources, though, if you want to do a more thorough investigation if you never have. This book by James A. Nestigan, a Lutheran scholar that I really respect. It's called Martin Luther, A Life. It is Augsburg Fortress Press. Check this out. This is a great telling of the story of Martin Luther and the beginning of the Lutheran Reformation. So, fabulous resource and very accessible. Of course, there's a full-featured, Hollywood movie about Martin Luther. Joseph Fiennes stars as Martin Luther. So, it's well done. It's good. So, if you got Netflix or whatever, Blockbuster, check this out if you want to, get a much better telling of Luther's story. But maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you just want a few minutes on Luther, so here goes. Martin Luther was born into a typical German family 500 years ago in the 16th century. And he was bound to be an attorney. And his dad was moving up the ladder, had copper mines, and was hoping that Martin Luther, who was an incredibly bright, intellectual person, very smart, would become an attorney. Well, that didn't happen. In a horrible thunderstorm that we hear about, and maybe you've been a part of a thunderstorm that scared you like crazy. This happens to Luther, and Luther prayed to St. Anne. That's what folks did back then, still do, I think, in the Catholic Church, but prayed that if he would be saved, he'd become a monk. I can't really believe that Luther had never thought about it before, but this is kind of the first time we hear about it. And so he prays, I'll become a monk. And lo and behold, he's saved, and he's true to his word, and Luther becomes a monk in the Augustinian order. What we quickly find out about Luther is that he had an incredibly intense introspective conscience. He was an incredibly honest person. And what he experienced in the church in his day was that, well, if you want God to accept you, because God, his righteousness is so great that, we have to cower before God and with our sinfulness. So if you want God to accept you, you've got to do all these things. And the church had a whole list of things you needed to do for God to accept you, in essence. And Luther kind of went down that road, but he was so honest. He'd be in the confessional all day, confessing his sins. He was so honest that finally he kind of burned out. It's like there's no way I can ever get myself to a place where I'm okay and God will accept me. One of the things happened, though, in addition to going to Rome, he was sent off to Rome and becoming really discouraged at what he saw there and all the corruption and the way the church was kind of exploiting people. Another thing that happened is he was sent off to study the Scriptures, and he got his doctorate in the Scriptures, and he knew Hebrew and knew Greek. We don't get a chance to say it somewhere else. One of the great things Luther did was translate the Bible into German, so the average person could actually read the Bible, because before Luther, no one could. It was only the priests, the scholars, etc. So he wanted to get the Bible into people's ordinary language so they could read it. It would be accessible to them. But he went off and he got his doctorate in the Scriptures, and when he studied the Scriptures, and he read in the New Testament things like we've heard already from Romans 3, and in Galatians and the Gospel of John, that basically make it very clear, crystal clear, that God's benefits are not earned. They're offered as a gift. When he read that, and then he looked at what the church was doing in his day, there was amazing conflict. Now that conflict came to a head around something called indulgences. There was a guy named Tetzel who was going around and raising money, in essence, for the building of St. Peter's Cathedral. That was an incredibly expensive venture, an incredibly beautiful cathedral. Still today, we're in awe of it. But it was very expensive. Well, the Pope was hugely in debt in this venture. And so this guy named Tetzel was going around, and he was selling something called indulgences. Now, an indulgence was where you could pay money and you would be given, a piece of paper which would in essence say for you or for someone you love that they would get out of purgatory and into heaven sooner or right away. There was a kind of sense that when we die, maybe we're not going to go to hell, but we don't have enough righteousness, enough merit to go to heaven, so we go to purgatory where we kind of earn enough merit to finally enter heaven. Luther saw that whole system as totally being contradicted by what he heard in the gospel and the scriptures and the New Testament, and the Old Testament for that matter. So Tetzel's coming around and selling these indulgences, and he was very theatrical and kind of scared the people, made them think they were going to be languishing in purgatory, or that their loved ones were languishing in purgatory, and so he would drum this up, and then of course people would want to pay for an indulgence to get their loved one out of purgatory. There was a sad, kind of almost funny little saying that was a part of it. Every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. Well, Luther saw poor people, widows, young mothers, giving just the meager fare that they had to buy a piece of paper, believing that was going to get them or their loved one into heaven. And he couldn't handle this. And so he wrote the 95 Theses and put them on the Wittenberg door, which was kind of like the Facebook of the day, really. And he posted it, and it kind of went viral, so to speak. The printing press had just been invented. And so Gutenberg, his great invention, Luther just got right in on that, and people started to publish his theses, and they went around, and people started to think about this, and Luther started a fire. And then, let me tell you what happens from there. That fire or explosion happened to the surprise of Luther, because Luther really believed that the leaders of the church of his day would listen to what he had to say and reconsider and say, wow, you're right, Martin. And they could have this dialogue and reform could happen. It's so important for you to know. Luther never wanted to split the church. Luther never wanted to start a new religion. In fact, he really didn't want anybody to be called Lutheran. That's for sure. But we call ourselves Lutheran now because we want to claim that heritage and those theological positions and the great things that Luther brought into the church. But again, that's where I go back to say that we're Christian, not necessarily Lutheran's an adjective. But anyway, so Luther wanted to have a dialogue and then it would all be good. But the thing that Luther also found himself in on is he was threatening the pocketbooks of the halls of power. And the Pope wanted to silence him, of course, and I won't go into the big long story now about how that happened. But Luther, bottom line, couldn't be silenced, and the fire that he started took off. And really, Luther was the beginning of what we might understand today as religious freedom, and he made his stand. And it kind of all came to a head at what they called the Diet of Worms. A diet was almost like a convention, a big get-together. Well, they were going to have a big get-together to have Martin Luther recant and finish this whole movement that had begun. And they put before him a lot of his writings, and Luther apologized because some were really too vindictive and spoke too harshly, as he said. But bottom line, he was asked to recant. He asked for some time to consider. He went through a horrible night of wrestling. He came back the next day and he said, I cannot recant. To do so, my conscience is bound to the Word of God and I can't go against that. And so he stood up. Well, there's a lot of political things to it, but Prince Frederick, a German elector, part of the Germany that Luther was in and living in, had just enough independence from the emperor to protect Luther, and he kind of gobbled Luther up and protected him and kept him from being killed, because there was others who said similar things to Luther who got burned at the stake. So Luther was kind of protected, and the Lutheran movement went on from there. And I really want you to look at some of these resources, because I could go on and talk for a long time, but that's just enough to give you a taste. So let me, though, sum this up with just a few phrases. We've had this concept of word alone, of grace alone, faith alone, that's the way God comes to us, and those alones have been really important to Lutherans. So those kind of theological positions that God transacts with us by His grace, freely, if you will. That's a huge part of the Lutheran movement. But another part, as we've already talked about when we've talked about the Word of God, is that Luther's position that when it comes to authority in the church, this is really huge, and this is the other reason that Luther got in so much trouble, is that authority rests not in the hierarchy of the church or the tradition of the church, although that's very important and very helpful, but the bottom line authority in the life of Christians in the church should be the Scriptures. So that's why I say word alone, grace alone, faith alone. That's important. But there's another pillar to the Lutheran movement that's so important, is that Luther really believed in what's called the priesthood of all believers. In Luther's day, the church was all about the priest and the bishops and the cardinals and the pope and the hierarchy. Luther felt like, no, the church ought to be about the lay people. And so Luther worked really hard to educate and teach lay people the Christian faith, because he went around and he saw that these folks don't know anything about the faith. They just come to Mass and receive communion and go away, and they kind of look at that in a kind of magical way, not just a sacramental way, but even a magical way. And so it just really just crushed him. And so he worked really hard to educate the laity. He said that's what the Christian faith is about. He wrote a small catechism for parents to use to teach their children, which we often use in our confirmation programs in the history of the church. He also wrote a large catechism, which is some of his best stuff. So that's he believed in the priesthood of all believers, and he believed that each person has a vocation in this world. We have a call to love our neighbor, like Jesus said. What's the greatest commandment? Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And so he believed that every person had a call, a vocation to do that. Whatever your occupation is, you have a vocation to be Christ to other people, to be a little Christ, if you will, to other people, and extend God's love and service. And we'll talk some more about what the Christian life looks like. But that's an important pillar to the Lutheran movement, is this concept of vocation. So there you go. That's a real quick, here's 101 on the Lutheran heritage. But I hope that helps. I hope that piques your curiosity. And I hope that helps you understand when we say Silverdale Lutheran Church what we're about. We're about a movement within the church for the gospel.